Okay, so you sent over some research about birds in airports. And it's interesting.
Yeah.
It kind of makes sense, but it's also a little scary, I think, when you think about it.
Yeah, a little unnerving for sure.
Yeah.
Especially if you're a frequent flyer.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
we're talking about bird strikes,
Right.
which have the potential for some pretty serious damage
Yeah.
and danger.
Yeah, and we are going to deep dive into this chapter
Okay.
from the book Wildlife in Airport Environments: Preventing Animal Aircraft Collisions Through Science-Based Management.
It's a good one.
And you think, okay, it's an airport.
Right.
What could birds possibly be eating out there?
Right.
But you'd be surprised.
Yeah, you would.
So get ready to be surprised, folks.
Yeah, this chapter really digs into this idea that it's not just about birds being a nuisance,
Right.
or, finding some stray French fries that somebody dropped.
Mm-hmm.
They are really drawn to airports because of the food,
Really?
even more so than shelter or water.
Okay, so it's like this unexpected buffet that's set out for the birds.
Right.
I mean, you think of all that open space. I've seen tons of birds at airports.
Right.
But I just, never really thought too deeply about what they were eating.
Well, and think about it this way. Airports,
Okay.
with their large areas of grassland.
Right.
And then you have these water bodies. For things like stormwater treatment, they become ecological hotspots. They unintentionally create these havens for all sorts of wildlife.
And the article mentioned that U.S. airports average something like 297 hectares
That's a lot.
of grassland each.
That's massive.
That's like a giant bird feeder
Yeah.
in the middle of a city.
It is.
Wow.
And that's just grassland.
Right.
Add in the water sources.
Yeah.
And you've got a recipe for attracting a huge variety of birds.
Wow.
Airports unintentionally provide food, water, and shelter.
That's all there.
The trifecta.
It's true. Yeah, you can put up some fencing. You can.
Right. Try to manage the water. But the food, it's got to be a real challenge.
It is a challenge.
Oh,
You can't eliminate every single food source.
Right.
Even with a team of, full-time wildlife biologists on staff.
Yeah. And so this is where things get really interesting, because the research talks about how the FAA's National Wildlife Strike Database shows that most bird strikes actually happen when the birds are out looking for food.
They're foraging.
Yeah, it's not just that they're nesting or hanging out.
Right.
They're hungry.
Yeah. And to really drive that point home, they looked at the 9 bird species most likely to cause damage to aircraft in grassland environments.
Okay.
Only one of them actually nests there, the killdeer.
Oh, wow.
All the others are there to eat.
So you're not even going to solve the problem just by managing nesting sites.
Right.
Wow.
You really have to understand what they're eating and why they're choosing those foods.
Okay. So speaking of choices, the article really digs into these 3 terms: use, selection, and preference.
Can you break those down for us in this context?
Absolutely. So let's imagine a bird eating some berries.
Okay.
That's a simple use. It's consuming a food source.
Got it.
Selection is more about an active choice.
Okay.
So if there were juicy worms nearby
Okay.
and the bird still went for the berries, that's selection.
So they're choosing those berries over other options that might be even better.
Yeah, deliberately choosing those berries
Interesting.
over other available options.
Okay, so just because you see a bird munching on something doesn't mean it was their, top choice.
I mean, it was their favorite.
Yeah, they might have settled
Yeah, maybe settling for
because
that.
there's nothing better around.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then there's preference.
Okay.
Which is, what the animal would ideally choose if all options were equally available. But that's harder to study in a real-world airport setting.
Right, I can imagine.
You don't have that much control over it.
So for airport management, it's really important to figure out what the wildlife is selecting,
Yeah.
because then they know what they can target for removal or management.
You nailed it. Removing a food source only works
Right.
if it was a deliberate choice.
It can't just be a last resort.
Right. Not just a last resort when they couldn't find anything better.
Okay. And this leads into another idea that the article really hits on, which is this concept of abundance versus availability.
Okay.
So it's not just how much food is there.
Right. Abundance just means the quantity of food.
Okay.
Availability means how accessible that food is.
Right.
You could have mountains of food,
Mm-hmm.
but if it's out of reach or hidden, that doesn't matter to the animal.
So it's got to be available.
It's got to be available.
The article had this great example with laughing gulls at JFK.
Yeah.
They prefer short grass over tall grass
Right.
for hunting beetles, even though both areas have the same number of beetles.
That's right. It's all about access.
Okay.
The short grass makes those beetles easier to catch,
Oh,
so they're more available.
To the gulls? Okay, so that really illustrates how availability can be much more important
Right.
than just how much there is.
Than sheer abundance.
And there was that other example with the raptors at Toronto International Airport.
Oh, yeah.
They're drawn to those short grass areas for voles, even though the vole density is actually lower there.
Again, it comes down to how exposed those voles are. They're much more vulnerable in the short grass.
But can't hide as well.
Right. Making them a prime target for raptors.
You know, you're making me think about all those times I've seen birds at the airport.
Yeah.
And I never really stopped to consider what they might be eating.
It's easy to just make assumptions
Yeah.
about their diets.
Right. I probably assumed.
Like, oh, they're eating seeds.
Yeah. Or worms or something.
Right.
But you never know.
Speaking of dietary surprises, the article highlights how our assumptions about what animals eat can be totally wrong.
Oh, really?
Animals, especially when food is scarce, will eat a far wider range of things than we expect. Their dietary breadth is wider than we think.
Okay. Are you talking about those snakes eating spare ribs and canned dog food?
Yes.
That the article mentioned?
Yes, I am.
That threw me for a loop.
Yeah. It's surprising, isn't it?
It is. I mean, does that work for them long term?
Well, it depends on a lot of factors,
Yeah.
but it goes to show how adaptable wildlife can be. They're constantly evaluating their environment and changing their strategies to survive.
But wouldn't simply removing all the berry bushes or whatever it is end up hurting other wildlife that relies on them?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It highlights the complexity of managing these situations. Sometimes the solution that benefits one species might have unintended consequences for others.
Yeah, so you really have to look at the bigger picture.
You do.
And how everything is connected.
Exactly. Take the case of tree swallows at JFK.
Okay.
Known for eating flying insects, they were actually primarily feeding on bayberries.
Wow.
Once those bushes were removed, strikes plummeted by 75%.
That's incredible. So just changing the type of grass.
It's not just the type of grass.
Okay.
But also things like mowing height and frequency. All of those things can impact insect populations, which in turn affects what birds are attracted to the area.
Yeah.
It's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah, it's like you're designing this landscape.
Right.
That's aesthetically pleasing, but also strategically unappetizing.
Exactly.
To wildlife.
It requires a deep understanding of both horticulture and wildlife ecology.
Yeah.
And that's where wildlife biologists come in.
Okay.
They can connect the dots and come up with solutions that really work.
So before we get into some of the solutions, how do researchers actually figure out what these birds are eating?
Right. You can't exactly just ask them.
Right.
So the most common method is examining gastrointestinal tracts from birds that have been struck by aircraft or from controlled populations. It gives researchers a direct snapshot of their diet.
Makes sense. But what about other methods? Like the article talked about regurgitated pellets, feces, direct observation feeding site surveys. Do those work too?
Well, each method has its pros and cons. Pellets and feces can be tricky to analyze because not all food items break down at the same rate.
Oh, right.
So you might miss certain components of their diet.
Yeah, I can imagine direct observation would be tough.
They can be, yeah. You're also more likely to see larger, more obvious prey items while missing those tiny insects that might make up a significant portion of their diet.
So you think they're eating one thing,
right?
But there's this whole other hidden menu.
Exactly. And feeding site surveys only really work for herbivores.
Yeah, you can't see what a hawk ate.
Right.
Look it on the ground.
Not unless they dropped it.
Exactly. So it sounds like finding the right method to understand their diet really depends on the research question and the species being studied.
Yeah, it really does. Each one has its limitations.
But the goal is to try to get as accurate a picture as possible.
Yeah, the more complete the picture, the better.
Of what they're actually eating.
Yeah.
And then you can start thinking about, okay, how do we manage or eliminate those food sources?
That's the key once you know what they're eating.
Yeah.
Then you can start thinking about how to manage or eliminate those food sources.
But that seems like a whole other challenge.
It is. It's like a giant puzzle.
Yeah.
Because you can't just remove a food source.
Right.
Without considering what might happen next.
Yeah, what are the consequences going to be?
Yeah, what are you going to attract in its place?
Right.
Are you going to create a more appealing alternative for the same species or attract something even worse?
Oh, gosh, yeah. So you got to be careful.
You don't want to solve one problem.
Right.
Only to create a new one.
Exactly. And the article really stressed involving a wildlife biologist.
Early on.
Yeah, early on in the process, ideally even, during the airport planning.
Right, in the design phase.
And construction phases.
Absolutely. They can help select landscaping and land covers that are naturally less attractive to wildlife.
So being proactive.
Being proactive rather than reactive.
Rather than waiting until it becomes a problem.
Exactly.
And they even had this handy table.
Yeah, they did.
In the article that gave some specific examples, like replacing, those turf grass varieties with species that geese find less desirable.
Right. If it doesn't taste good, they won't eat it.
Yeah, and also, removing specific types of vegetation to deter deer, certain bird species, other wildlife.
Right. So it's all about making the airport less hospitable.
Yeah.
From a culinary perspective.
Less tasty for the wildlife.
Yeah.
But even with all those strategies, there's still those three major attractants that seem so difficult to manage.
Right.
You've got carrion, you've got agricultural crops, and then you've got municipal solid waste.
Yeah, the trifecta of trouble.
What makes those so challenging?
Well, with carrion, you're attracting a whole host of scavengers.
Okay.
Not just vultures.
It's not just the vultures.
Right. We're talking hawks, eagles, owls, crows, and even mammals like coyotes and raccoons.
Really?
So because it poses such a high risk,
Yeah.
it needs to be removed immediately.
Oh, so it's not just about, what type of animal is attracted to it. It's just the sheer number.
Right. The sheer diversity.
Of different species.
Yeah.
Okay. What about agricultural crops? What makes them so tricky?
Well, some crops, particularly corn,
Yeah.
act like giant magnets for birds.
Oh, yeah. Flocks of birds. That'd be bad.
Yeah, and you can imagine the safety risk posed by a large flock of birds taking flight near an airport runway.
I don't even want to think about that.
It's not a pretty picture. So the research suggests there might be some crops that are compatible with airport safety, but more research is needed.
Okay, so it's not just, a blanket statement.
Right, it's not a one-size-fits-all.
We can't just assume that all crops are bad.
We have to look at each situation
Yeah.
on a case-by-case basis, taking into account the specific crops, local wildlife, and the overall airport environment.
So there might be a way to do it.
There might be.
Safely.
Right, sustainably and safely.
I never thought I'd be advocating for farming at airports, but...
It's all about finding creative solutions.
Yeah, it is.
And that starts with understanding the intricate connections between habitat, food availability, and wildlife behavior.
And you keep saying connections, and the research also mentioned this concept of food selection occurring at scales larger than the airport property.
Right.
What do they mean by that?
It's a reminder that we can't just look at the airport in isolation.
Oh.
Animals don't pay attention to property lines or fences.
Right, they're just going where the food is.
They're moving across the landscape, following food sources wherever they lead.
So the airport might just be one stop.
Right, one stop on their foraging route.
In their travels.
Exactly. A bird might be feeding on airport turf grass during the day, but then head over to a nearby wetland to roost at night. Or a flock of gulls might be feasting at a landfill miles away.
Okay.
And then use the airport as a place to rest and digest.
So you can do a great job managing everything within the airport.
Yeah, you can create this perfect little bubble, but you can't control what's happening outside those boundaries.
That's true. Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's essential to consider that surrounding landscape and how it interacts with the airport environment. It's all connected.
This is pretty complex stuff. If someone's listening to this feeling a little overwhelmed, what's the one key takeaway you would want them to remember?
The next time you're at an airport, take a moment to look beyond the buildings and runways.
And see it as this living, breathing ecosystem.
Exactly. Think about the birds you see and what might have drawn them there. Picture that web of food resources woven into the fabric of the airport environment.
You're making me see airports in a whole new light.
Once you start seeing it that way, you begin to appreciate the complexity of the challenge. And hopefully, it sparks a desire to find solutions that benefit both humans and wildlife.
Well said. I think this is a good place to pause.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
For now.
But there's still so much more to explore.
There is. We will pick this up again on the next episode.
On the next part of this deep dive.
Join us for the final part of this deep dive. Where we'll delve even deeper into this fascinating world of wildlife food at airports. So we've talked about, the big challenges, But what are some of the specific foods that are like these beacons to wildlife at airports?
Right, so we talked about carrion and crops and waste, but we can't forget about the seemingly insignificant things like insects and earthworms.
Oh, really? Something that small can cause that big of a problem?
You'd be surprised they are a staple food source for many birds, especially those that forage on the ground.
Yeah, and the article talked about how even just the type of turf grass can make a difference.
Yeah, certain species of turf grass are basically like setting out a 5-star buffet.
Oh, wow.
For birds like Canada geese, they can't resist it.
So choosing the right kind of grass is almost like, this passive form.
Yeah, it's like built in.
Of wildlife management.
Right, and it goes beyond just, what type of grass you plant.
Okay.
Things like how often you mow and how short you cut the grass can also impact insect populations.
Oh, wow.
Which in turn influences which birds are drawn to the area.
So there's so many factors.
Yeah, it's like you're choreographing this dance
to consider
between aesthetics and making the airport less appealing
to birds,
to our feathered friends.
Yeah, less tasty for them.
Exactly.
Which is why having those wildlife biologists involved is so crucial.
Yeah, they're like the conductors.
They're the conductors
of this whole orchestra.
Yeah, they can see the big picture.
Right, they can see the whole picture.
So it's clear that managing wildlife and their food sources at airports is about way more than just picking up some trash.
Right, it's not just about shooing away a few birds.
Or putting up a fence.
It requires a more holistic approach, one that considers the entire ecosystem.
The whole ecosystem.
Whole ecosystem, and that means everything.
Right from the types of plants and grasses to how those landscapes are managed.
Even what's happening outside the airport itself.
Exactly. It's all connected.
Yeah, and we have to remember that wildlife isn't just randomly showing up.
Right. They have a reason for being there.
They're making choices.
They're making deliberate choices based on their own needs.
And their taste buds.
And their taste buds.
So we've got to understand what's motivating them.
Yeah, understand their motivations.
To be there.
Yeah, and then use that knowledge to make the airport environment less enticing.
Yeah.
Without harming the animals or disrupting the balance of the ecosystem.
It's a challenge.
It is a challenge.
But it's also an opportunity.
It is an incredible opportunity.
Yeah, it really is.
It's about finding ways to coexist peacefully and safely.
Recognizing that airports are part of a larger web of life, not just isolated islands of concrete.
Well said. This has been such an eye-opening deep dive, I feel like.
Yeah, me too.
I've gained a whole new perspective.
It's a powerful reminder that even in these seemingly sterile, human-dominated spaces, nature finds a way.
And we have a responsibility to manage those interactions with care and respect.
Absolutely.
So next time you're at an airport, maybe you're stuck on a delayed flight.
Right.
Take a moment to just look around.
Look beyond the hustle and bustle.
Yeah, and imagine that hidden world of wildlife.
Going about their lives.
Going about their business.
Right.
Yeah, and think about all those amazing adaptations.
Right. The things that allow them to thrive in these really unexpected places.
Nature is full of surprises.
It is.
Even in the most unlikely settings.
That's what makes it so fascinating to study and so important to protect.
Well, this has been another episode of The Deep Dive.
Until next time, keep exploring.
Keep exploring.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
And remember that adventure can be found anywhere, even at the airport.
Even at the airport. And if you happen to see a bird snacking on something unusual,
send
us a message. We want to know.
We'd love to hear about it.